From exciting new weapons to interesting companions, all the way to a more expanded upon exploration, Ghost of Yotei is shaping up to be the sequel we always dreamed of. And while the story of Jin Sakai will be missed for sure, there are many new things Sucker Punch is adding following the recent State of Play reveal. Of course, also feel free to comment down below which of these features are you most excited about. And on that note, I'm also opening up a brand new giveaway for a free copy of Ghost of Yotei for all of my subscribers. Just make sure that you leave a comment down below and also leave a like on the video if you end up enjoying it. That being said, the combat is in for a major shakeup compared to the first game. While it's not clear yet if katanas will continue to retain their 4 stances from back in Tsushima, it seems that the R2 quick menu function now lets us instead select between the 5 new weapons that Atsu is capable of wielding. So besides the katana, there's also the Yari, aka the spear, then we have the KhrazeGaming, the dual katanas, and finally the oversized Odachi that surprisingly has its own dedicated button via R2 plus L2. Who knows, maybe it's because being so big needs its own separate slot section. However, from a gameplay functionality point of view, they largely seem to fit a similar role, while also adding even more layers of complexity to the combat. So for example, the Odachi seems to be especially useful against some of the larger brutes, somewhat of a replacement to the moon stance we had back in the first game. Meanwhile, something like the dual blades are especially made to counter enemies with spears, which in and of itself opens up a whole new layer of difficulty. So while in the first game you would largely swap stances based on the types of enemies that you fought, in Yotei you're going to also have to pay attention to what weapons they actually wield so that you also counter those. Which actually sounds really interesting given how they can now also swap their weapons on the fly, so talk about completely relearning how to fight back again. And on that note, a cool new mechanic added is Disarm. Now Atsu actually has an ability she can learn that lets her disarm enemies and make them drop their weapons. But guess what? They can also do the same to you. So that actually comes in the form of these new heavy attacks that are indicated by the yellow glint. In this case, if an enemy successfully connects that with you, you're going to see Atsu dropping her current weapon on the ground, which means you're no longer going to be able to use it unless you physically pick it up from the ground once again. But guess what? There's actually an early on counter to that from the looks of it, which comes in the form of the disarm counter. So if you successfully perform a focus attack against an enemy during that yellow glint phase, you can end up disarming them instead. So talk about countering the counter. Good to note, however, is that dropped weapons can be picked up by Atsu when getting close to them, like in the case of the spear right here, which she subsequently throws at one of these targets, instantly taking them down in the process. But the good news is that pretty much every weapon also has its new moveset. So for example, we can see the KhrazeGaming has a couple of them. There's one that can be used during the stealth with the triangle and circle, which is going to make it so much easier to just assassinate targets from very far away. Just like sub-zero them to you and instantly assassinate them. Of course, we also have to cover at least one of the other new weapons, which is the ranged option called the Tanegashima. This is a type of matchlock weapon that was introduced to 16th century Japan by the Portuguese, which in the video we can see with devastating effects, one-shotting this target pretty much from a very respectable distance. So this ended up massively changing how warfare was done from that point on. However, it still did not completely replace the longbow just yet, mainly due to its low rate of fire compared to some of the bow options, which is why we still see them as an option even in Ghost of Yotei. So who knows, maybe we're gonna have full dedicated builds to the matchlock, just like how we had the longbow back at the end of Iki Island expansion. But with that out of the way, we also have to talk about exploration. Not only do we have new features over here, but features from the first game are also making a return, but greatly expanded upon. And at the heart of the exploration, we have the clue system. This is something that we had at least to a degree in the first game as well. When asking citizens, they would occasionally reveal points of interest on the map, like new missions, but that has been greatly expanded upon in a completely new system with a a lot more player agency this time around. So Atsu can actually go ahead and gather clues in various ways, one of which is by interrogating other warriors she defeats in combat. It seems that as long as we just leave them alive, we can now have an option to interrogate them and find some extra information. And from the looks of it, that information can pertain to other individuals that we can go ahead and hunt, but possibly it could be to other points of interest too. So for example, in this scenario over here, we can see that two of the options revealed involved a character called the Oni, which if we were to interrogate or find a clue about that person, this leads to us unlocking the Yari, aka the spear. We can even see where the location is at, in this case somewhere around the Ishikari plain, center west of the map. But there's also at least one more option, which is the Kitsune. If we were to choose that person instead, this would end up unlocking the Kusarigama further up north into the region. So depending which weapon you want first, you can kinda choose to make your own adventure at your own pace. You can even sort through existing clues straight here from the main map menu screen, kind of like how we did back in the previous game when filtering through all of the points of interest. Speaking of which, it appears that there are multiple categories of clues as well. So the ones over here that we see are called revenge, which seem to involve characters that wronged Atsu in her past one way or another. Some of them even tried to unalive her in very brutal ways, but others may involve, for example, discovering new techniques or maybe even tools from some of the tooltips and thumbnails that we see over here. Another mechanic that seems to be expanded upon, or at the very least changed compared to the previous game, is basically the legend of the ghost, or the reputation system, which in Yotei mostly revolves around the new idea of bounties. So as you progress in the game and as your deeds precede you, Atsu can actually get a bounty on her head, which means other mercenaries and bandits will recognize her and even try to hunt her down, kind of like a reverse police system if you want to think about it that way, which actually sounds really interesting given the fact that in the first game the reputation system mostly only affected the ability to acquire new ghost related skills, and that was basically it. However, it goes a step beyond because you can also take bounties on other targets yourself, which you will do by these new bounty boards that we can seemingly find in all sorts of locations and possibly towns and cities. In this case, we can see that we can pick up multiple of them at a time, and in this case they also give you various rewards. From the looks of the gameplay, it was mostly just the in-game currency, so I'm going to assume that these are some lower level bounties, and some of them pretty much involve, for example, bandit camps. Some of them lead you to bandit camps where you have to take down a specific leader. Others may involve one-on-one duels and so on and so forth, something that's also making a return from the first game, and I absolutely love the one-on-one duels back in Ghost of Tsushima. But besides that, also on the exploration side, we have quite a few more changes. We have slides now that let us quickly descend from higher places and mountains. We can also use traveler maps that we can purchase from cartographer NPCs. These look like small little puzzles that we have to physically find and match with the portion of the map that we want to unlock. In this case, we can see it's being matched with this river junction over here in the middle of the map. Also, speaking of the map, this is the full size of it. Of course, we don't really know exactly the size of it, but we can at least see the shape of the map and kind of speculate on how big it is. Also, speaking of exploration, Spyglass is going to be one of the new tools that we can use to scout out objects of interest, be it specific buildings, but also targets that we can equally mark down and have present on our HUD. Also, flower streams now give us a speed boost, which is actually a pretty interesting antithesis compared to how Jin was actually interacting with them in the first game. He was kind of taking a different approach, slowing his hand and slowly caressing the flowers, compared to Atsu, who's actually gaining speed. So I think that this just shows you the difference between Jin's philosophy of taking in everything at a slow pace and enjoying the moment, compared to Atsu, who's actually just storming in at full speed. Also, another interesting mechanic is the camp. We can actually set up camps now and have access to some cool other things, one of which is cooking. We can now cook our meals in a first-person view, and apparently it's going to be important to have a good meal before your next fight. Who knows, maybe this implies we may get some interesting buffs or something useful in combat out of it. Also, travelers may ask to join you at your camp as you're just sitting by. Like, for example, we can see that this merchant is making their way in, and if you accept them, they may even sell some items of interest. Like, for example, this one was implying they sell a cursed mask with some interesting results. But you can also play the shamisen, the musical instrument that we see on Atsu's back in various of the shots, but there are a few other possible things I can see out of this. Like, for example, maybe just the ability to sleep things off and make the time pass by a little bit quicker. However, a huge quality of life added over here is the visual character compendium. So instead of navigating menus of names that we may no longer remember, now we can see the portraits of the characters we meet at a glance. In this case, we can have all of the information at our fingertips, such as, for example, whether they have something new for us or not. Some of them may have new missions that may unlock new special powers. Others may be vendors with new items in their stock for us to peruse, but a lot of these are pretty much very easy to see straight from this menu screen. Also, on a similar note, did anybody catch on the fact that we can now inspect our weapons in a first-person view, which is actually pretty interesting? It kind of gives me some Red Dead Redemption 2 vibes, which is always appreciated. Attention to detail is always really nice in these types of games. Similarly, we have a bunch of mini-games, both new and returning ones. So for example, we have this painting mini-game that lets us create sketches of our surrounding environments. But we also see this coin toss mini-game in which Atsu is flicking a coin in first-person mode. Who knows, maybe this is the grand variant of Ghost of Yotei, something that, to be honest, was sorely missed in the first game as well. Besides that, we have bamboo strikes making a return. Previously, they would provide buffs to our resolve bar, but there's also hot springs, which in the previous game would provide buffs to our maximum HP. It's very likely, however, that we may have others as well. Like, for example, they showed the ability to go to shrines once again via the jumping puzzles, which seem to work very similarly to how it was back in Tsushima. The skill system looks quite similar, but there are some differences over here. So instead of the technique section and like the samurai subsection, now we have the growth. And of course, since Atsu is not a samurai, she now has multiple categories relating to core abilities: Onryo, melee, revenge, and wolf, which is going to be her companion. So for example, we can see only a few of them, but Onryo kind of seems very similar to what the samurai subsection was back for Jin. In this case, we can see perfect parries over here as one of the possible trees, with also the disarm mechanic, but also involving assassination abilities and also some to survival. It's anybody's guess what the rest entail. It's likely that the melee revolves around some of the new weapons and unlocking new abilities for them, but I can definitely see that the wolf one relates to our new canine companion. So let's talk a bit about this because we skipped over it, but it's basically going to now be one of the new companions we can have with us in combat from the looks of it, and the wolf is very useful. So in this case, we can see that it can take part in standoffs with Atsu and even help her take down enemies. So for example, in this shot right here, as Atsu is taking down one of the targets at the correct moment, the wolf is doing something similar to the target to her right side, which should mean dispatching large groups of enemies is easier than ever. But again, it's still going to be an acquired skill, so you have to time your attacks just right during the standoffs. In terms of charms, there are some massive changes here too. One is that Atsu is capable of equipping all major charms in all of the 6 slots, not just 2 of them like how it was in the previous game. Another one is that acquiring higher levels of the charms is also different now, as we can directly level up the charms themselves. So for example, we can see that to level up the true aim one, we just need to defeat 10 enemies with a Yumi while having that equipped. And I'm gonna assume that that number will increase from level 2 to level 3. 3. But we also have new and returning charms, so we can see that, for example, the Hachiman's favor from the previous game, I think that was either a deluxe edition or a pre-order bonus, is making a return. Also, Charm of Amaterasu, which in the previous game was giving heal on kill, is also there. And there's also this new charm of the Futsunushi, which behaves similar to the Mizunokami, giving you easier parries, perfect parries, and perfect dodges, but there are many new ones over there. So looking forward to all of the new build diversity and whatnot. Obviously, it goes without saying that customization was a huge part in the first game, with many cool looking armor sets, many more that were added over the course of DLC and also the free updates, plus on top of the fact that we had so many ways to customize them too, with additional color schemes, which are all making a return over here too, with a massive selection of bonus armors and other attires. Interesting, of course, to know that we also have the Sakai clan armor over here to the right side, some kind of Easter egg, but it looks very similar to it, so let me know down below in the comments if you also think it looks very similar to that. And that pretty much concludes today's video. These are just some of the things that are coming out in Ghost of Yotei. Of course, if you have noticed any other new features or cool new additions in the gameplay presentation, do let me know down below in the comments. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.